Shall we begin? We can start then, right? Cool.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us here at the 29ers. It's a pleasure to have all of you here this early evening. First and foremostly, thank you to the 29ers for having us. Steve, Galloway, thank you so much for making this possible. We're about to have a very, very fun presentation. As Claire said, interesting, not controversial. And we look forward to delivering that to you guys tonight. So I'm just going to start with some introductions. My name is Zach Kauraisa. I am a double law graduate with a master's in international oil and gas law, and I've done research on this fancy little topic called negotiating with China. I also currently work at one of the leading commercial law firms in Namibia, and this right here is my colleague.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Niel Swanepoel. I just graduated with my honors last year from UCT, where my thesis and research interest was on Chinese diplomatic communication, and especially how that plays out in Africa. So it's a very exciting topic, really excited to talk about it. And Zach, kick us off.
Thank you. So let me start by giving you an overview of some of the topics we're going to touch on this evening.
Sorry,
we're
Zach,
going to start off with the China-Africa matchup, which is just, what is China doing here? Why are they relevant? Why are we in this room? What are the activities? Are those activities good, bad? Let's unpack that. What's their relevance to the Namibian situation and the African situation? The second portion is going to be on Chinese culture. We're going to unpack China as a nation and the Chinese as nationals, get to know them a little bit better as we move throughout this conversation. And then we dive into negotiating with China after getting that background of what China is doing in Africa and getting to know them a little bit better. And I'm going to introduce you guys to a topic called the 36 stratagems, which is the core of negotiating with China. And right at the end, we're going to ask a very pivotal question, which is, what can Namibia do with regards to everything that we're going to unpack, and what can we as African nations do? And then hopefully we can have a really, really fun Q&A right at the end for a little while. Now, as we begin, when two young, charming, and handsome gentlemen such as me and Neil have to present a topic like negotiating with China, the first question we're going to ask ourselves is, why China? Why is China so important? And so let's start there. China has a $14 billion GDP, second largest economy currently, and they're predicted to become the world's largest economy by 2033. Between the years 2000 and 2014, China has invested over 350 billion with a B, US dollars with a US dollar, into over about 140 countries and territories all around the world. They're also the largest manufacturer of goods and the largest exporter of goods. And so simply put, if you want to buy anything, you're going to get it cheapest in China. And if you want to sell anything, you're going to access billions of people in China. So everybody wants to be in business with China. That's about the core of that. Now, let's talk about the role that China and Africa play, or the interplay between the two powers that be. On one side, we have Africa, and on the other side, we have China. So Africa, as we're all well aware of by now, is well endowed with natural resources. We have about everything you can think of: gold, copper, platinum, silver, uranium, dimension stones like granite, marble. The list does go on. And you can find that all across the continent. There are a few examples up there. But despite those resources, Africa does have an infrastructure deficit. Many countries ranking at the bottom of many infrastructure indicators: the roads, the buildings, the railways, the ports. There are problems all across the continent. And although Namibia is lucky enough to have some of the best infrastructure on the continent, it's not the end of the story. So that's in the African situation. On the other side, we have China, that has experienced tremendous growth since the 1990s. Tremendous growth to the point where it struggled to maintain the growth of its economy with the commodities it could find inside China. And so in the year 2000, the Chinese government put out a white paper, policy paper, the core of which was, we can't sustain our economy with local commodities. Go out into the world, wherever you can find something, and bring it back. And over the past 30 years, that's exactly what happened. Or all over the past 20 years, that's exactly what has happened. And China has established their footprint all across the continent. Now, You have on one side China with money and a massive construction industry, but they don't have the commodities for their economy. And you have on the other side, Africa, with a plethora of commodities, but not enough capital and infrastructure to really grow in the way that it needs to. And that matchup has led to China becoming the #1 infrastructure financier on the continent, which is something to say. Now, a presentation wouldn't be a presentation if it didn't have at least one graph. This is our one graph. This tracks the amount of loans or the loans that China has extended to African countries over the past 20 years. As you can see, from the year 2000, when the white paper was put out by the Chinese government, there's been a steady increase in the financing that's been provided to African countries over the years, peaking at about $25 billion in 2016 alone. Now, you will see that Angola is kind of earmarked. We want to see exactly how big or noticeable a portion of the financing Angola has gotten. And I'm sure the rest of you can put together that as far as getting resources and providing financing, it's largely because of Angola's mix of oil deposits. I believe that was relevant to indicate here off the back of Shell recently announcing a discovery, the coast of Namibia, and today Total announcing a massive discovery off the coast of Namibia. And so if things go the way we all expect and hope them to go, we can see similarly noticeable investment pouring straight into our country, which makes this entire discussion and the entire role of China very relevant to us here today. Next. As we said, on one side, we have infrastructure, on the other side, we have resources. And so what has come from this is something called an infrastructure for resource deal, or a resource for infrastructure deal, however you want to structure it. We've seen this in Angola when China provided a $2 billion oil-backed loan for infrastructure in the early 2000s, and they've done a lot more since, as you saw. While in South Sudan, 1/6 of their daily oil output is provided to China for the Exim Bank to unlock infrastructure financing. And so there is definitely an exchange happening across the continent. Where do these infrastructure for resource deals find their home, their necessity? Well, usually it's in countries where they have a low credit rating. And so the EU and the USA have stepped back because these countries are perceived to be way too risky to be dealing with and extending financing to. And that's the little gap that China identified insofar as stepping forward, like in countries like Benin, where they said, okay, let's make something happen here. Because you have resources, but you need financing and infrastructure. We can provide that. And so these deals are definitely necessary from a broad perspective. These deals also have very favorable terms. Terms such as minimal interest rates, 5% to as low as 0% interest on some of the financing, 25-year repayment terms, 5 to 7-year grace periods, and technical assistance as well as far as building the infrastructure. Now, I don't know if there are any finance professionals in the room, but I can say this. If you told a finance professional that you would give them money for 20 years and they don't have to pay anything for the first 5, and you're going to give it to them at 1% interest or less, that's what they define as free money. And so these deals definitely serve an important role as far as accessing financing and generous financing at that to build the infrastructure that African countries, such as Namibia, definitely need. Now, I don't think this talk would have much relevance if the deals were all good and there was no reason to have a toolkit for negotiating with China. But I did want to start off by establishing that these deals are not all bad and that there's value to be derived here. Now, upon further inspection, we see some of the flaws with these deals. Some of the flaws definitely come from the deal structure. So here's one of the ways that an infrastructure for resource deal might be structured. China may unlock, let's say, $4 billion in financing for your new railway. And you're going to celebrate. You're going to say, wow, thank you. Thank you for the money. And they'll say, well, we're not going to give you the money. We're going to give the money to a Chinese contractor who will build the railway for you. They're going to get all the cash. And you're going to say, okay, I mean, fine. I'm sure there are other benefits. And then there'll be additional conditions, such as the raw materials that will be used to build the railway or the whatever infrastructure it may be, the cement, the steel, it won't be sourced locally. China's going to push all of their steel and all of their cement into your jurisdiction in order to build that. So we're not going to use your raw materials. And then as far as labor is concerned, from the white collar all the way down to the blue collar, we're going to insist on at least 50% Chinese nationals building this thing. So we're not really going to hire your people either. And then as far as ancillary and support services to these massive investments, such as the trucks and transport services that are going to haul these massive loads or other equipment that's going to be provided, we're going to import all of that as well into your country. We're going to use our guy. And so when the deal begins to take shape in that manner, you begin to see that the economic impact begins to get constricted, because the point of economic or the point of investment is that ripple effect. It's not just that we're going to give this massive amount of financing to a local company that can get taxed, but it's also that local people are going to get hired, and that's money into their pocket that they can circulate into the economy. Is that we're going to buy steel and cement from local producers who, and that will support their businesses, and as they grow, they get taxed. And so I'm using ancillary services as well, the transport, the food, the catering, the security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how the $2 billion investment actually ripples out into a nation and helps it grow and develop. And the moment you begin to constrict that, you see scenarios where African countries continue to get poorer and poorer and poorer, but they have a shiny new railway or a beautiful big port. But the economic circumstances around the country still haven't changed. And that's unfortunate. And what has happened across the continent is that the people, the nations have began to reject those deals. In Nigeria, one president signed a deal. The succeeding president said, no, we don't like it. We're not going to do it anymore. That's a problem. We don't like the deal terms. In Gabon, we've seen mining projects where some of the labor terms that I spoke about not so long ago, the mine workers rioted. They said, no, we can do the job. How can you do that? And so there have been problems on the ground, as well as in Benin, where Chinese contractors managed to access tax exemptions way beyond what local contractors could access, and thus making them just unbearably competitive as far as local entities were concerned. And so because of that, there has been backlash on the ground with regards to deal structure and problems implementing the deals. And at the end of the day, we ask ourselves, well, how did these deals get concluded then, if they were really so bad? And that leads us to understand that there's been a flaw in the negotiation process, and that there's a fundamental misunderstanding that African nations have of China. We don't understand the negotiation counterpart, and we don't understand the country in and of itself. They're just here, and they're doing business here. And I think it's important that we begin to expand our knowledge on this powerful country that has access to the exact things we need, especially when we have the things that they need. And so for that purpose, as we begin to expand our knowledge on China, I'd like to invite my colleague Neil to unpack China a little bit for you guys. Please give him a warm welcome.
Ni hao. So like I mentioned in my very brief introduction, my honors thesis dealt with the topic of Africa and China, of China in Africa. And I looked specifically at the communication strategies of a Chinese state-owned magazine that was catered to an African audience. And when Zach and I we were talking about how are we going to conceptualize this presentation and then sort of involve my research, I think we realized that the key overlap and what I really want to focus on is how culture influences Chinese argumentation strategies, which in turn influence negotiations. And I just found that really fascinating about just how the interplay of culture and politics influences, how Chinese people see the world, and how that influences how they try to persuade people of their views. So these 4 pillars are what I've sort of decided, or I'm going to speak about 3 of them. I'm going to talk about how the socioeconomic and political climate and Confucian philosophy influence Chinese rhetoric and communication. So let's start with the political system. Now, the history of modern China is the history of the Communist Party of China. Since 1949, the Chinese Communist Party have ruled China with quite an iron fist. The Chinese policies implemented, really influence the day-to-day living of all people living there. Another key, so along with that comes the aspect that China is a centrally governed state. This means power is very centralized, and that extends to economic power as well.
So businesses are effectively an extension of the state. And even the SOEs that operate and mining companies that operate in Namibia have deep ties to the government. And another important part that's very relevant is that there's no room for dissent in China, especially when it comes to the CPC. And I think the obvious example of this is the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. So this leaves you with this hybrid system of a centralized state, but like Zach has described, it's really trying to expand outwards in a very sort of capitalist-dominated global trade environment, willing to do deals with anyone that it sees merit with. And that makes for a really interesting and unique negotiating partner, and one which isn't driven by the same interests and goals as a private firm from the West. So let's move on to Confucianism. So Confucius was a philosopher and politician in ancient China, and his teachings are really, really key to understanding Chinese culture. It's very, very important, and it's even in today's the way that Chinese behavior and their values, a lot of it is linked to Confucian teachings. And I'm going to try and outline how these Confucian values really influence Chinese culture, which in turn influences how they argue, how they try and persuade. So the first thing that I think is very important is this concept of social harmony. So the end point, the end goal of Confucianism, as I see it, is to live harmoniously, the peaceful coexistence of all people everywhere. Now, Confucius teachings try and do that in different ways. So the first thing is that this harmony is obtained through a very rigid social structure, a very hierarchical society. So, children must listen to their parents, families must listen to their sort of regional governor, the regional governor must listen to the central party apparatus. And it's very, very structured. And so keep that in mind. What's also important for social harmony is the ability to present uncomfortable truths in a non-threatening and a non-confrontational way. In this way, agreements or disagreements can be resolved without conflict or violence. And what's also very important, and I want you to remember, is that Confucian philosophy is a lot more emphasizes group prosperity a lot more over individual liberty or individual rights. And that's a lot different from our sort of Western-centric individual culture, and very important to note. And the second focus is on interpersonal relationships. It's very big in Confucius philosophy. So the family is the central social unit in ancient China. And this is sort of developed, especially in the modern communist version of China, into work units as well. So Dan Wei, as the word over there, refers to sort of work units that act like a family. And within those work units, trust is very, very high. But outside of them, trust is very low. And this is often this trust barrier that is important to acknowledge and difficult to break through as a foreign when foreigners try to engage with China. And the second important two terms that I want to introduce you is Guanxi and Renqing. And these terms are basically refer to the basis of trust and the basis of strong relationships in both the personal and the business context. And once you've sort of adopted those behaviors and those virtues, you become the ideal Confucian gentleman, which is something sort of this thing that all Chinese strive towards, and what's seen to be sort of as a very noble person, a very wise person. And I think by understanding the values and the Confucian aspect of culture that I've just outlined, you can really build up better Guanxi, this trust and personal relationships in your negotiations with the Chinese, and better understand their way, their lens of looking through things. Now, I want to go talk about something, that I found really, really cool, and what I did a lot of research on is Chinese rhetoric and argumentation. So if I succeed tonight, and that's a big if, it's to try and show you, to put a Chinese lens over how you view the world and how you find things persuasive and what appeals to you to like someone or to find their arguments appealing. And again, it's very, very closely related to culture. So let me start off with introducing the yin-yang dimension in Chinese rhetoric. Now, the hierarchical structure of Chinese culture means that the power imbalances in society have really shaped how the Chinese argue, how the rhetoric that they used is employed. So yang rhetoric, one of these sort of the two, the yin and the yang rhetoric is a very direct form of argumentation. It's confrontational, it's direct, it's usually top down. So it's how your superior will talk to you. It's how a father will talk to their son. It's how a member of the Chinese Politburo will talk down to his inferiors. But what I think is a lot more interesting and more relevant, especially in a negotiation setup, is yin rhetoric. So yin rhetoric is a lot more indirect. It's where you're trying to criticize without provoking someone, allowing them to save face and not be humiliated. And it's a very sort of oblique type of rhetoric where a lot of the points are inferred and not stated explicitly. And this really embodies several Confucius values, like I mentioned, saving face, a respect for authority, and working within hierarchical structures. That's very important. So I'm going to run through two argumentative forms that use this yin type of argumentative structure. So the first one is argument by analogy. So just to refresh your memory, an analogy is something, if I say life is like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're going to get. So where you're comparing two completely different things, but they have something in common, and that's sort of an intuitive argument. So this is a very common type of Chinese argument. It's intuitive and it appeals, again, relating to that social harmony. It appeals to a sense of common understanding among these terms, among these analogies that you use. But most importantly, it allows you to avoid head-on criticism. So when you argue through analogy in Chinese culture, in Chinese situations, and you want to criticize someone that's hierarchically higher than you, it's best to do it through an analogy. Because it means you're not really directly criticizing them. You're not humiliating the person you're talking to. And I think the person that you are sort of indirectly criticizing will respond to that and see that you're allowing them to save face, which is a key cultural importance. Now, the second form is appeals to authority. So as I've tried to establish, social order is very important for the Chinese, and therefore, when you're able to link a claim, an argument, or a certain vision that you're articulating by referencing a certain elder, a certain person in authority, then that automatically lends more credibility to your claim. And I saw this a lot in my research and my honors thesis when I was looking through these articles written by sort of trying to cover public affairs. As soon as they start mentioning governments or people in authority, their word is law. Like, they don't criticize that. That is sort of assumed to be the standard, and they don't criticize that. And I think this is something that's difficult for us coming from a Western journalistic, background. I mean, we don't accept authority just because they're authority. In some ways, it's a fallacy. Because if you're just appealing to authority, you're not really getting to the meat of the argument. And I think understanding that there's this disconnect between how we argue and how the Chinese see arguments, it's important to note. So I think what I've tried to show you in my brief section of this presentation is how the political climate of China and their culture through the Confucian values are really, really important to the strategies about how they see how they attach value to certain argumentative positions or certain strategies. And I think what I'm trying to impart to you is to use these strategies, to think about using appeals to authority, to use analogical reasoning when you're engaging with the Chinese. And I think keep in mind this idea of authority when Zach talks about his stratagems, because a lot of what I've mentioned here, the appeal to authority, figurative criticisms, is very relevant. So I'm going to shoot it back over to Zach, and he can take us to the negotiation angle. Clap.
I like that. And you guys are so obedient. It's like clap. Yes, sir. I love that. All right. So, so far, we've spoken a little bit about China and what they're doing in Africa and their role here. And we've also, through Niel's work, began to unpack a little bit about Chinese culture and the way they communicate and the way they perceive certain things. And now, using that as a backdrop, let's talk about how the Chinese negotiate, which is the core of the tool. And the concept I'll introduce you to is the 36 stratagems. Now, the 36 stratagems are long-lasting Chinese cultural traditions and strategist thinking. And it's the way that business people and people at a high political level operate as far as the way they perceive the world. I have a slide later where I'll identify to you just how deep the 36 stratagems go. But for now, suffice it to say that there are several stratagems for several scenarios, whether you're in an attack, whether you're in a defensive posture, depending on the negotiation scenario, there are various strategies that can be employed at any given time and that work very, very well. There's not enough time to go into all 36 of them, and so I'll run you through two of my favorites. And so it's story time. The first stratagem that I really appreciate is lure the tiger down the mountain. So, as I said, all of them have these really archaic, ancient titles to them. Even the second one is hold the dagger behind the smile. It's really fun. It's at the end of the day, these things are centuries old. They're hundreds and hundreds of years old and deeply rooted in Chinese tradition. So let's begin with lure the tiger down the mountain. Essentially, all that it means is you have to get your negotiation counterpart outside of their comfort zone and into an environment that you control entirely. And so I'm going to tell you two stories that come from reports and literature on the subject and that are completely true. The first story was relayed to me when I made this presentation to a Ghanaian government official. So in luring the tiger down the mountain, at the start of a negotiation scenario, the Chinese may say, you know what? You've never been to Beijing. Please, if we negotiate this deal, please come to China. We'll pay for your flights. We'll pay for your accommodation. We'll pay for your food. It's on us. You need to experience our culture so we do this right. And so they book you into a lavish hotel. They pay for everything. They put you in from Tuesday all the way to Friday. Your flight leaves at midday. The first day you arrive, you will say, okay, let's negotiate this this $2 billion investment into infrastructure in Namibia that we publicized so greatly in the newspaper with this diplomatic trip. And you're going to want to negotiate, and they'll say, you have jet lag. You just arrived. Rest, please. You will take their advice. Wednesday, you wake up fresh. You will say, let's negotiate. And they'll say, that's not how we do business. We're about relationships. We're about the person. We don't negotiate as institution to institution. We negotiate as people to people. And the institutions are simply a conduit for that. As Niel mentioned, building Guanxi, which is that relationship. And so they'll say, let's introduce you to our people, the other officials that you should know. Let's do some lunches, some breakfasts, some dinners, some teas, some coffees, some biscuits. And that's what you're going to do that Wednesday. And you will understand because it's important to nurture the relationship. Thursday, you will say, fine, I know everybody. Let's negotiate. And they'll say, have you ever been to Beijing before? If you're going to negotiate with us, you need to understand Chinese culture, tradition. Let's show you our architecture. Let's show you the way we live. You have to understand who we are before you can strike a deal with us for a 20-year project. And you'll be taken on tours. You'll go to the top of beautiful skyscrapers in Beijing. It'll be a wonderful experience. It really will be. Friday, you're going to be escorted to a boardroom. And the boardroom is going to be filled with documentation of this. Lots of stacks of papers. You're going to be handed a contract about this thick, and they're going to say, there's the deal. Please sign it. And you as a prudent negotiator, you're going to say, no. I haven't had time to consider all of the papers. I need to take all of this documentation home with me, peruse it, get a clear understanding, and then I'll give you my decision with regards to whether this deal works for us or not. And your counterpart may say something along the lines of, if you leave this hotel room, the deal is off the table. And you're going to have to go back to your country after it's been highly publicized that you've taken a diplomatic trip to secure $2 billion worth of investment. and explain to your president that the reason you couldn't conclude the deal was because you were sleeping, having lunches, breakfast, and dinners, and traveling, sightseeing around China. And I don't think you're going to want to have to make that explanation. So we suggest you sign the deal, take the documents back with you and read them there. Otherwise, it's off the table. And that's an insurmountable amount of pressure. People lose jobs over that kind of pressure. And that happens to be the experience of a Ghanaian colleague of mine. And that's a wonderful way to implement that strategy. Let me tell you another story. I'm sure we're all aware of the phones, Sony Ericssons. They were really popular early 2000s. Who had one? Some old people. Before Sony Ericsson did that collaboration, there was just Sony and just Ericsson. And during the time that Sony, with its Beijing arm or Chinese arm, invited Ericsson to come to Beijing, again, we'll cover everything, accommodation, hotel rooms, please negotiate here with us. They invited Ericsson out. In the same hotel room, they booked in Nokia, who was directly competing with Ericsson for space in that market. And there are reports, not reports, there's literature that the Sony Ericsson negotiators, or rather the Ericsson negotiators, would bump into the Nokia negotiators at the breakfast buffet in the same hotel room. So that's directly creating pressure by virtue of controlling the environment that your counterpart exists in. And again, further in that literature, it describes how the Sony negotiators and the Ericsson negotiators would be in a room, and when the deal terms were not coming to the liking of the Sony negotiators, they would say, and I quote, "This deal, you say yes or you say no. If you say no, we're going to go out to Nokia right now. They're outside. They want this deal. But we don't want to talk to Nokia. We want to talk to you. So please choose." And that's when you bring someone out of their environment and you really control the narrative around the entire negotiation. You apply the time pressure by deciding when they get to leave Beijing. You apply competitive pressure by deciding, or rather ensuring, that their competitors are negotiating the exact same deal in the same building at the same time. It's really fun stuff. Another strategy: hide the dagger behind the smart. This is just some good old bait and switch. How this strategy would play out would be, let's say it's a business meeting. You're invited out by your counterpart. Please come to our country. We're going to have a great time. We want to get to know you. We want to build a relationship. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. And the moment you arrive, they're going to say, "Let's go out for dinner." And you're going to have dinner, and they're going to say, "Let's go out for drinks." It's going to be fun. Your negotiation team, my negotiation team, are going to go out for drinks. Everyone loves drinks. And you guys are going to drink the night away. And of course, at first, you're going to be hesitant and reluctant because you're a prudent professional who doesn't do that. But the moment your counterparts say, "Look, we're doing this thing, do this thing with us. We'll handle tomorrow together. The worst shape we're in, the worst shape you're in, ultimately, it's out. And we'll decide this thing tomorrow." And you trust your counterpart and you proceed to have a lovely night. The next morning, you're extremely hungover. But tomorrow is the start of a hard negotiation with a completely new negotiation team, different from the people you are drinking with previously. And now you have to negotiate because you're there to strike a deal. And there is a team ready to strike a deal. And how are you going to explain that you're too hungover to make anything happen? Again, these are the various stratagems that can be implemented in a particular situation. And there are 36 of them. They all have equally detailed stories and mechanisms for application. And these are the stratagems that one would have to be aware of because these are used by Chinese counterparts. Here's an interesting thing. That is a 36 stratagems children's book. As you can see by the lovely colors and the lovely design, I don't think it's for anyone over the age of 12. But this is what I mean when I say that the stratagems are deeply ingrained into Chinese culture. This isn't some kind of secret sauce that is, kept behind closed doors by the elite. This is something that you teach your kids. It's a game. It's part of the adventure. You hide the tiger behind the smart. Look the tiger down from the mountain. It's fun. And so it's just a part of the culture, the way you raise your children, the folk stories you tell, and the fun that they have as they go through day-to-day life. And I think that's an interesting food for thought for all of us to keep in mind the moment we clarify and understand how these stratagems find application at the highest level. Now, what can we do about it? We've spoken about China and their role here. We've spoken about them as a counterpart, as a nation, as people. And we've spoken about some of the strategies they may use. Let's have a quick run over what we can do as Namibians and as African nations as a whole to strengthen our position, to have better negotiation outcomes. First one we can do is build alliances amongst African nations. Right? The thing with negotiation is a lot of the time it's about leverage. Chinese were to come forward and say, we want the copper deposits on your land. We're willing to offer this type of deal, this type of arrangement. And you say, we don't like the arrangement. They could say, fine, we'll go to Zambia and get copper there. That's just very different if there's, for example, a coalition of African copper producing nations that collaborate, share information, and as a group control copper supply from this region. Now there's bargaining power. Now, if you don't take copper from me, you can't get copper at all. That's a similar situation with OPEC, the oil-producing countries of the world controlling supply and demand in that way. And that is something that African countries can take into consideration, especially SADC, as far as building alliances and sharing information so that no one is ever left alone in the woods at night. The second successful strategy that may be used is building larger multidisciplinary negotiation teams. I think many African countries, and Namibia is no exception, our negotiation teams are often made up of 1, 2, 3 high-level people who represent the entire nation and going to these rooms and negotiate the deals. Whilst on the Chinese side, you'll find a 15-person negotiation. 18, 20 people have accountants, lawyers, engineers, psychologists, business developers, business management consultants, political science graduates. We have a team analyzing your deal from every perspective and trying to pick it apart and get the best deal for them. And I think that's a big lesson you can learn as far as having bigger teams and more perspectives. Now, before I touch on the last 2 points, I just want to throw out a quick reminder that although I unpack the stratagems and although we unpack what African nations can do to get better ground in these negotiations, let's not lose sight of the fact that there's value in relationships with Chinese counterparts. They're a very powerful entity throughout the world, and we need to be able to leverage that. We need to be able to build strong relationships and strengthen our negotiation position moving forward, not to antagonize. The point of this talk is definitely not to be divisive, but to sharpen us, that we can have better negotiations and more effective negotiation outcomes. And so for that reason, the third point is developing guanxi. As Niel mentioned, guanxi just being the relationship between the two of you, goodwill, so to speak. It is perfectly fine to have a dinner with your Chinese negotiation counterpart, to go to Beijing, to invite them to Namibia, to introduce them to your colleagues, your family. It is encouraged that you build that relationship. But of course, once you're equipped with the 36 stratagems and understanding them, you won't be naive in any of the situations, that you can actually develop a relationship in a good faith way, not from a naive perspective, but from a perspective where you're aware and you're conscious. And so it's important that we do that. And then the last bit, which I quite like, is just negotiating China. Just use a translator. I think all the countries in the world, especially non-English speaking countries, have made great strides to be able to negotiate in English and so on and so forth. But it's a great show of goodwill to be able to say, you know what? We're going to get one of our translators. Please feel free to speak the way you want to, and they'll tell us what you mean instead of us speaking the way we want to. Excuse me? Can you trust? You can have to be your translator. Yours and only yours. And hopefully they're on your side. I think there are quite a few Namibians who can actually speak Mandarin and Chinese. One of them happens to be in the room. I won't point him out, but he's here. He's great. And at this stage, I will pass over and invite Niel up again to discuss some of the challenges that we face as far as being able to have a great working relationship with China and really expanding on the value that they have to offer as we move forward. Yeah. Clap.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, I think let me sober up the conversation after Zach has pointed out these wonderful opportunities for engaging with China and successful strategies. But there are I'm speaking more generally now, there are barriers to to better Namibian-Chinese relationships. And that's what I'm going to go through over in my slide. So I think the first thing, it's something both Zach and I have found with our research, is there's a very little research and a small literature on Namibia-Chinese relations. And this is an issue because we are engaging a lot with the Chinese. They're going to be a key part of our future, as is the case with many African countries. But we aren't really learning from these interactions. We aren't studying them actively. And if we don't do this, we're going to be at a strategic disadvantage when dealing with them. And I think this is definitely something that, in the private sector, in the public sector, in the multilateral NGO sector, is definitely something we should invest more resources in. Something I'm sure as Namibians, we're all quite on the same page about is there's definitely a lack of integration among the Chinese community in Namibia. And I think this doesn't help the stereotypes and the othering of the Chinese community in Namibia. And I hope this talk has given you a better idea of why that might be the case. We've explained the confusion background, the close family ties, and the general skepticism about people that don't share the same sort of value systems and cultures as you. And I think this is something that we can all try and improve upon. Because this leads into my second point, is not only are the Chinese hesitant about us, but there's also lots of distrust among Namibians toward the Chinese. I mean, this plays out in narratives about the Chinese being involved with every single poaching wildlife issue in Namibia, or that their deals are very unfair, that they're neo-colonists in Africa. And I think that just stems from a certain lack of in-depth engagement with the Chinese. And also, I think what shouldn't be overlooked is just how different these cultures are. I mean, if you can't speak the same language as someone, how are you going to understand even remotely their opinions, their viewpoints, and where they're coming from? Hang on. And then the last thing I want to talk about is, these challenges aren't insurmountable or impossible. I think it's normal. I think there's teething issues with any new sort of intercultural, cultural clash between different peoples. And I think it's just important that we really, really prioritize intercultural learning, compassion, meeting the Chinese on their grounds when learning about them before, real conflicts arise, real disagreements that'll make it very difficult to move on. And I think that brings us to our concluding remarks. I hope we haven't bored you. And I think the two things that I'd like to say is just point out that we really need to fix the knowledge imbalance in China-Namibia relations. Because I can tell you, they know a lot more about us than we know about them. I mean, the amount of people, I think Zach said one person in this room can speak Mandarin. That's not good enough. If we can't speak their language, we don't know anything about them. They can speak English, they can do a lot of research on Namibia, but we are at a key strategic disadvantage when negotiating with them, when engaging with them, if we don't learn more about them. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is just to understand that, our approach to reasoning, to persuasion is very contextual. It's not universal. The things that we think or we hold to be universally true or logical is not the same for a Chinese person or a Russian person or a South American person. Cultures differ, and we can't oversimplify these relationships as good as bad. And I believe there's much to learn and appreciate from this new sort of emerging global power. So my advice would just be, lean into your inner Confucian gentleman and just, get to know the Chinese better. Over to Zach.
From my perspective, I told him to please say, in case you're wondering why he did the back take. From my perspective, the third point is ensure that you know the 36 stratagems. At the end of the day, if you're going to be negotiating with a particular counterpart, be knowledgeable about the strategies that they're using, the mentalities that they have, so that you don't find yourself outmaneuvered in any particular situation. The last is China is heavily invested in Africa. They're here to stay. I think we should embrace the status quo, and I think we should work to build relationships. As we started off at the beginning of this presentation, they're valuable. They have what we need, and we have what they need. I don't think the relationships are separable at this stage. And I don't think we should pretend that they are. And I don't think that this presentation should create any kind of divide or antagonistic relationship, but rather highlight the need for a closer bond and a closer relationship and a better understanding of our counterpart, so that we can leverage those opportunities, not only for the country as a whole, but I know a few people in this room who have engaged with Chinese businessmen on deals close to $50 million, $1 million, and they're going to be very rich by the end of the next 2 years because of it. And there are opportunities all across the board. And I don't think we should run away from that or try away from that. And it's like this. That's all. Those are our contact details right up there. I have done a full research paper on this particular topic, which is available at the link that you can see there. You can shoot me an email anytime. Neil has also published a full dissertation that's available on request in case you want to know more about Chinese culture. We're pretty nice guys. We just send me up, we can have a chat. And with that said, we're about time. So please, thank you very much. So I think we're going to be able to have a Q&A around the stage.
I just want to say to people on the Zoom, I'm sorry the slides got stuck at some point. So I'm going to ask Beck and Neil to put the whole slideshow onto the Slack group, please. And then we'll put the talking bit up on the Zoom. Yeah, Q&A. Don't forget if someone asked us, repeat the question.
Good.
Does anyone have any questions before we put this? Okay. Okay, we share some position that people have questions. Anyone want to ask a question?
Yeah, let's do it. There's our mic. And then we must just repeat the question.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a very enlightening presentation, and I must say, very relevant, especially in the time we have right now. Can we have a slide? I want to get back to the second last before your meeting.
The conclusion slide. Dean, could you connect our projector again?
That's your slide.
Discussing the issue of integration.
Sure.
Yeah. It's very that we pick that one up, because we not only are the deals that we are entering into in China actually negatively affecting our economy, but also the fact that they are not integrated. As from your side, what can we do? What policies can we put in place to make sure that these people integrate? It's so bad. These people don't pay in hotels. These people don't, everything else, they grow their own food, everything. They are not actually supporting the local economy at all. So we ask you, what opinion, what policies can we put in place? Thank you very much.
If you have something to add, you can go first. I'm just going to sort out this slide with you.
And the question was that, or rather the question identified and reiterated that the Chinese in Namibia in particular haven't integrated, or they don't integrate, and they remain very separate from the Namibian people. And what can we do, perhaps from a policy perspective, in order to encourage integration between our cultures and theirs and our nationalities and theirs? I'll start off by saying, I don't know if that's a policy problem. I don't know if we can legislate that. I don't know if we, as government, we can step up and say integrate. I don't think that the problem is solved at that higher level. I definitely think it's a personal problem and a cultural and a perspective problem. With that said, I do think that the problem also isn't only that perhaps the Chinese are integrated with Namibians, but perhaps also the Namibians are scared to integrate with the Chinese. And so I think that both parties will probably do well to expand their curiosity about each other and want to know more about each other as a starting point. But I will say that from a practical perspective, this is the role of the embassy at the end of the day. The Chinese embassy does have the cooperation economic portion or department that should be responsible for cultural exchange. It should be responsible for establishing workshops, for meet and greets, et cetera, to enforce that type of collaboration and integration between the people. And so I think that's the first step. It's the embassies speaking to each other about how can we get more people in? How can we create events and spaces where Namibians and Chinese can know more about each other and learn to love each other. Neil?
Thanks, Zach. Yeah, I think you really covered it pretty well. I think it's a question with no easy answer. And I think a start is understanding why the Chinese are very, I don't know, territorial, I guess you could say, when they arrive in Namibia and tend to sort of congregate amongst themselves. I think that's sort of been developed through how their Confucian values influence that. But your question is how do we invite them to the party, have a more integrated society? And I think it goes both ways, and I think it requires, from the Namibian side, a greater understanding of this culture. And I think I'll come back to it. I can't overemphasize how difficult it is to connect with people when you can't speak the same language. And often you find that the Chinese laborers and workers that live sort of isolated in compounds, they can't speak English very well. So it's just a very, very difficult situation where hopefully greater ties, and like Zach mentioned, cultural exchanges, greater trust between nations on both political, business, and social level can sort of help people get out of their shells and just be a little bit more. And I think we see that in the Chinatowns around the world. You know, that's where integration has started historically, and hopefully that can just follow the same trend in burgeoning Chinatowns of India.
So mine may be a good word of an economist description, I'm not sure, but it's good to see that China now on the attempt to sort of go past the industrial place and the manufacturing place for more high value economic state. They kind of need to move their factories somewhere. They're going to be making Chinese cars because they're going to be building them somewhere. Their goal is essentially to make China their Africa. Do you think we have any leverage in negotiations from that perspective, especially given the fact that we also want to jump up onto developments of state?
I have a follow-up question. What do you mean by they want to make China the new Africa? What do you mean by that particular statement?
Because the economy is very manufacturing oriented, but they want to become a more sort of service oriented. They want to sort of go from the
Move up the value chain.
Yeah, move up the value chain. Exactly. To go to for generally most people are, for example, in software design and that kind of stuff. Basically, the development level, the economic stage that high income economies are in instead of data sort of upper middle stage. And then, especially a country like Namibia, which is also upper middle income countries, will, so more than anything, we're competing with each other. I mean, obviously, we're much smaller as a country, so we're not going to be building much, but when it comes to the stage of development, we're really sort of comparable. What do you have any leverage?
Maybe I'll just start to say that's a very interesting question. I was actually, Zach and I was chatting about that whole thing, about whether Africa can take up the reins of being the factory of the world and taking over that sort of title from Africa, from China. I'll leave Zach to talk about the negotiation aspect of that. But I think definitely that is a reality and a goal, a strategy that we can strive for. And should definitely feature in how we try and engage with the Chinese. So, Zach, what do you?
Thank you, Neil. In case anyone is wondering why we're holding that, that's for the Zoom attendees so that they can hear what we say. I'm not just doing that.
It's also a stratagem number 17.
hold high the microphone for the Zoom.
It's a hidden one. Gotta stay focused, guys. Gotta stay focused. As far as moving along the value chain and where we can, if I'm understanding your question correctly, and where we can leverage China's movement towards service-based industry and Africa's movement outside of the commodity-based economic or value chain overall, there is opportunity, but I think that opportunity also comes down to statistics. I think the reason why China could rise to that role as the manufacturer of the world, so to speak, is because of their massive population. And not only because of their massive population, but also because of the vast amounts of people that are extremely poor in China. And so they're willing to work for very, very little. And so once you have hundreds of millions of people that are that poor, you can really generate and produce items at a large scale at fractional cost. And so I don't think, not all African countries have that. And I think Namibia is a particular exception because of our tiny population. We have cities as big as Namibia population-wise. And so that's just an arena that we may not be able to compete or enter into at that level. Of course, there are exceptions because we have so much land, so much space. And so we can definitely produce, let's say, whether it's with regards to agriculture, we can definitely become a kind of a place that feeds the world because we just have so much open land. And so I think there are lots of barriers to that question. I don't know if Namibia is the country that's going to perhaps occupy a space like China as far as manufacturing is concerned. But I think maybe we can also jump along that commodity, skipping the manufacturing and going to service space. I think as we progress, that might be a future for us. We'll have to see.
Can I start the question when you? Okay, for example, seeing this in the perspective of government, you say, for example, create these connections with other African countries. For example, we have this organization of contributing South African countries. But then you have countries like inside, like Zambia, like Angola, like Congo, like moving populations which are only going to maybe even double in the next century. Whilst China has a almost existential demographic problem. You know, they've got an extreme aging population, very few children, very few future people who are going to be able to then fill up the jobs that they have in the manufacturing process. So I suppose it is something. I'm just giving my question is just there is something we can use, and that's.
I'll tell you this. This is a really, really cool thing. Promise is really, really cool. It's really, really cool. Promise. You remember when China put out that national policy that, look, we have too many people, everyone's only allowed to have one baby. Remember that? They stopped that. And so the Chinese middle class is expected to get an additional 300 million people over the next decade, maybe a little more. So, yeah, there's opportunity, and this is where the opportunity is. And the Chinese government also established policy directives with regards to this. A major concern for the Chinese government is agricultural security. They have so many people, and they're about to get a whole lot more, and they're concerned about how they're going to feed all of these people. And so when you enter a country like Namibia, where we have so much vast open land, agriculture, because there is a market for it. And there are already business people within the space who are occupying that space, who are producing nuts, cabbages, apples, raisins, grapes, whatever you think, people are making it, and the Chinese are not scared to buy it because they can't have enough. People need to eat every day. And so as far as thinking about where can we leverage, what can Namibia do, I think that happens to be a very cool lineup with regards to the needs of China going forward, and the disadvantage that happens to be an advantage that Namibia has, having so much open land and not enough people to occupy it. And so think about that. I don't know. Okay, anything else about that?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. So more on a criticizing note, could you bring up maybe security here, sort of get swap or basically that? And we speak about stream money for a quite specific area of waste going on. We neglected a very important component, and that is security that becomes important. And following to that, there are several examples in Africa that actually taken political infrastructure to their mission. Now, tying that back to one of the conclusions that says integrate the status quo. The status quo to Africa has been rather used. We're not going to China. China's going to Africa. There's a lot of people that know Chinese people on the ground, the time, the Europe. I know someone that has got a Chinese friend, they're involved with the mine, they swap them. They're friends with 2 or 3 of the Chinese folks. The rest of them serve these guys. They're not really here. They come in here within Europe, but some of them are allowed to engage and integrate, and some of them aren't. I think there's a misconception and misunderstanding of the real intent they're coming with. It's not unknown that Africa has become quite an easy place to thrive, and that's not only to China. The West has done it the same way. If you look at what happened across Africa with diamonds and what, I think that's something that we'll probably elaborate on. Last quarter. Economic folks, trust economic in Britain, because we're now just surmise the question lightweight. And what I think there's one section I do in that sense that it's not the onus isn't necessarily only on the Vietnam that the status quo as is not conducive to that.
Thank you for that. Just to make sure everyone got the question and also just ask the question back at you, make sure we're on the same page. The first portion of your question is the Chinese or the China-Africa relationship isn't all that sweet. It's not that great. As far as some of the loan deals, regardless of their fantastic of me being hyperbolic, but regardless of some of the really good terms like 20-year repayment periods, 5-year grace periods, low interest rates, there are a bunch of hidden terms above the conditions that we set out, such as the security that these countries have to put up, or rather an interesting concept out there is a Chinese debt trap, where essentially the Chinese would come into a particular territory and say, hey, we think you guys are in a strategic position to have a really nice port right on your coast for import and export. How about we loan you a couple billion to build it, and then they build it, but the economy isn't strong enough to repay that loan. And the moment you default on the loan, the Chinese say, okay, give us the port. And now we control the strategic port in your country. And so I think that's the first portion of this question where they say, look, the Chinese sometimes come in and they take advantage of the situation. And so, and to further expand on that on a more interpersonal level, they don't integrate. Some of them come in with a very superiority-based mindset. And they think, you work for us, we're superior, we're helping you, you are lucky to have us, etc., etc. So I just had a chat with Neil quickly where he said we'll take on the integration portion, the more interpersonal portion, and I'll address the first bit. I don't think that this presentation at any point shied away from the fact that the China deals aren't all that great. I think I've adequately outlined, how sometimes the economic impact is restricted, and that hurts many companies and many countries. And once they default, lots of bad things happen. No doubt about that. That just happens to be the name of the game as well. Sometimes the Chinese are out for the best deal for them, and if they can get it and you sign it, tough. And that's the importance of going through the 36 stratagems and beginning to understand, okay, how are we being outmaneuvered? What can we do better so we don't end up in certain deals? It's also the value of being realistic about the deals that we enter into as African nations and knowing that, look, if we're about to take on $8 billion of investment, even if we have a 5-year grace period, how much we have to pay in debt service, we can't handle that. We can't manage that. And thinking smarter about how we move forward from there. I think the Chinese are in it for them. We're in it for us. And in these situations, they won. And I'm not saying it's fair. I'm not supporting it in any way. But this happens to be what has happened, and the Chinese have strengthened their position across the world because of it. And that's the value of this talk. It's to try and circumvent that. But as I said again, ultimately, as much as we want to stop these terrible, terrible situations from happening, especially from an economic perspective, there's value there. I didn't want, the idea that the Chinese are coming in and striking very, very bad deals and doing some very, very bad things, as you highlighted, across the country, to make us think that we should never deal with the Chinese ever. That's also not possible. We have to deal with them at some point, in some manner, in some form, and let's be educated and protected as far as how we go about that. That's about what I can really say to that question. And Neil will handle the integration portion of that.
Yeah, maybe just to also add my 2 cents to what Zach has said. So, I mean, the Hambon Tota in Sri Lanka is a very well publicized example of debt trap diplomacy, as the Americans like to call it, where the Sri Lankans couldn't sort of repay their loan, and as collateral, the Chinese have taken ownership of a port that they built for, I think it's 90 years. But this, I know the literature quite well, and this is the exception. Debt trap diplomacy is not a Chinese strategy. It's something that they are as not eager to enter into as us, because it's also a major loss for them. Now they're sitting with these like huge sort of pieces of capital that they can't always use very well. In 2017, at the annual China-Africa Forum, Xi Jinping actually said that no more vanity projects in Africa. So negotiating these vast, really big projects and monuments and stuff that costs a lot, and there are issues of collateral, China's not going to finance them anymore. And although there's this idea that we're getting so in debt by the Chinese, the statistics don't exactly back that up. If you look at the amount of debt that Africa has and owes to the world, China accounts for 20%. Western countries, international organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, that's where most of our debt servicing goes to. So I think it's not wrong that you mentioned that they're negotiating very good deals for themselves, not for the Africans. But that's also part of their long-standing policy of non-interference. So since the beginning of the modern Chinese state in 1949, a key policy has been the policy of non-interference, which basically says we are not going to meddle in the domestic affairs or politics of any country, which has in effect allowed them to trade, to negotiate with countries like the US, with Japan, become very rich, even though they are quite enemies ideologically. It's allowed them to engage, invest, and trade with countries in Africa with very questionable human rights records, with presiding over failed states. But their approach is, hey, it's not our problem. We have a policy of non-interference. We're not like the West, who have all these conditionalities on their loans and their agreements. We are just trading partner. So I guess that would be how I would answer that.
Just a small point, and this will be a very pessimistic point, unfortunately, that I have to mention about these deals. And maybe it's because I work in commercial law, but these are all commercial terms. These types of deals happen in private sector all the time. We're going to borrow you money to build whatever you're going to build, and you're going to pay us the money back. And if you don't pay it back, we're going to take the thing. And I think we all feel really personally about it when it happens to be something that's happening on a countrywide scale. And there are deep narrative as far as political agendas go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, and again, maybe it's because I'm biased. I'm working on commercial transactions all the time, but these are commercial terms that aren't foreign in private sector. If you're going to build a railway, but you're a private company, isn't government building the railway, and you go to a big bank and you say, okay, I need this much to build it. We're going to charge people this much, et cetera, et cetera. The security you're going to put up if you project finance that deal is the thing itself. Again, it's unfortunate when it happens on a national scale, and there are lots, there's a string of negative impacts that happen after that. But I don't think we should forget that these are commercial terms, and if I'm giving you $1 billion or multiple billions, there are strings attached there. I hope that's
ladies and gentlemen, I do understand everyone wants to exchange, and we want to respond, and we want to have exchange of conversations. But during such a setting, we sort of have back and forth conversations between one question, we will engage. I think this will be the last time. And then
Just want to say, so the fundamental difference when you go into a parallel between a commercial agreement and a sovereign structure like that is when you negotiate, when you make a commercial loan, in that loan, you stipulate which staff that helps use. So let's say FMB makes a loan for a new bridge. Does FMB go and say that you can only use FMB employees to build a bridge? That's a fundamental difference here. Because if you cut down the pipeline, in other words, the revenue that they could make back from such a deal, then you're basically setting them up for trouble. That's a big difference here. And that is how they structure these deals. And to your point, they do interfere. That's a fact. They've interfered with US policy. They've got spies there. They've had a lot of trouble with the Chinese people, and they stem from a communist centralized power state. A lot of billionaires that came out of China have been executed by sought after asylum elsewhere. It's not, you can, and I understand what you say, but the reality is they lie. They lied several times.
okay, can we discussion about, and I'm going to continue. Guys, I'm seeing everyone's hands, and I'm following you. But
As you
I'm not entertaining your questions back and forth. So I know it's a very passionate topic. Everyone's here for.
No,
Just give everyone a chance.
I guess just one question for everyone. So just to tie that one point up. I don't know if Neil's going to say that we'd love to see the literature he has on the subject as well, so we can speak as academics and researchers as opposed to news reports or something of the like. So we'd love to engage his literature, just to be sure that we're speaking on equal terms about the matter. As far as the interesting point on deciding, which laborers you should use for a particular project and how banks don't do that, I like that. He's right, that is something that's unique, but it's primarily because banks don't want to do it. And if it's my money and I'm borrowing to you and I add conditions, I could. Banks just don't want to keep. And if you have bankers in the room, so they can attest to that as well. So next question, please.
Thanks a lot. My name is Gregor. Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Neil. I think you've balanced very well, elevated this so well done that because it is indeed a sensitive topic. I'm just looking around the room and I don't see actually any Chinese colleagues or friends yet. So I was actually wondering, because I know you have been engaged in probably a lot throughout your research. And sorry if I missed it, I'm kind of being anyone. Exactly was telling the stories about some of the stratagems, so maybe I missed it in Neil's first part. When you present your findings maybe to the Chinese counterparts, I'm just wondering what their reaction is, and if that is also kind of a first step in the right direction, also, as we were saying, overcoming some of those challenges, of course, for mutual understanding, and maybe tell us a little bit more about your experience in trying already to do so. I'm sure that's what obviously you're aiming for. Thanks again for your presentation.
You have engaged China, I have roots, but have you? Of course, you have. Because of that, I'll throw a small thing up in you go. Perfect. Fine. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. Really, really appreciate that. Thank you for coming. Well, we don't have, vast exploits throughout China in connecting our research over the past 20 years and shaking hands with business. But thank you. I'm glad it came across that way because it's thoroughly researched. As far as engaging Chinese individuals on the subject matter, that's not a massive opportunity we've had. We haven't exactly presented some of this research to Chinese governments or anything, or anything to that level, but I have had this discussion in rooms with mixed individuals. And I remember I was lucky enough to have one Chinese person in the room. One. It was really cool. And they were perfectly fine with it. Of course, the talk had a little bit of a different narrative, had different focus points, but ultimately their comment was, this was really, really accurate. Of course, they didn't feel guilty for some of the conditions of the deal because they weren't the ones striking them. It's like my government. Why would I feel guilty about that? But as far as the way we unpack Chinese modes of thinking, their culture, and concluding with the fact that let's build relationships, let's build guanxi, let's use Chinese translators. Yeah. Ultimately, there's value in our research and in China-Africa relations. And for those who are listening, I'm sure you've got the optimistic note somewhere in there about how we should collaborate a bit more. And that is the thing that the one Chinese individual that was in the room, that's what they saw and that's what they attached to. And they said, yeah, I know government did some weird stuff, but I'm glad you're not creating an environment where I, as a Chinese person, am now going to experience xenophobia because your talk is done and people don't like me. I'm experiencing that people want to talk to me more now because they want to find out how they can make money from me. And so that's been my experience with that.
Yeah, I wish I'd had more sort of conversation with Chinese people on this topic, but at least I've been in engagement with supervisors and mentors that have had these conversations with the Chinese. And something that's very interesting in the China-Africa context is that they are extremely interested and concerned about their public image in Africa. Because, contrary to what it might seem about how it looks on the ground level, at the political level, it's very important that China and Africa can remain partners. So in the research that I did, it was like the most common theme in this magazine across 20 articles across 6 months post-COVID is just emphasizing and hitting home how China and Africa have cooperated, how they have created sort of this relationship stemming both from sort of anti-colonial past and the shared experience that they have of that. So the way that the Chinese feel about this topic, they have a big interest in it. And I think they know that a lot is at stake and they need to ensure that there's a public profile on how Africans really feel about them is noted by them.
Thank you very much. I'm your honor here. I just want to thank you for the presentation. Quite informative. I would have expected you more focus on the strategies. But thank you very much. Me and Dr. Lekondo have done a study some years ago about the perceptions of Namibians in the retail and construction industry. If you are interested in that, I can email it to you. What was very interesting is we invited the embassy to help us presentation, but they never pitched. And afterwards, they phoned us for having dinner. But I refused that. Of course, if they don't want to attend the presentation, there's nothing to discuss. So, but I would say that Chinese we have to realize that they are very clever. Diplomats. We can learn from them. They are subtle negotiators. And look as Namibians, when we negotiate with the Chinese, we already are at a disadvantage because of the dependence that's been created due to the liberation assistance during the liberation struggle. So I think that context is very important to remember. If you go into negotiation already with a disadvantage. And then the other point is the power and our inability to structure financial deals that is to our benefit. So I would suggest, and I would like to know from you, what do you think about forming joint benefit with the Chinese as a matter of principle for any negotiation to be successful? Because in that way, you will gain self-control. In not just, that's not just to our disadvantage. Because if you look at sometimes the
The deals are so good, but we don't actually need that amount of money. We call green roads, like the Western bypass. This costing us $18 million per kilometer, where we could have secured with other options based on the previous study that I've done about procurement. So we don't do our homework before we start negotiating. How can we improve on that from your perspective as a lawyer? And then secondly, what about forming joint ventures with them? That was also one of our recommendations in the study. Thank you very much.
I like you. Thank you very much. Please email that research to us. I thought that was very, very interesting to hear. I'm going to tread carefully moving forward, simply because the one thing you never want to do is start talking about specific pockets that you don't have much experience or at least researching, especially when you're sitting 2 steps above and people are listening. And so I'm going to be very careful with your question. And so please forgive me if we don't go on a really long chat. Joint ventures are a wonderful structure. Put them together before, they're fantastic. They're a great way to spread the risk. There are several joint ventures between government entities and private sector entities, where private sector entity will put down the money. The government entity or the local entity will provide some kind of resource, like a mining license or exploration license or a piece of land. And then the other counterpart will put down financing. After their financing or after they recoup all of their money, then there's an equal profit share or something along those lines. It's great. Those are wonderful structures. And so I do see the value in them. I don't know whether a joint venture will work for every type of transaction, or not say transaction, but rather not every single deal that government executes is a transaction. So if we're building a road, that road project is not going to get any revenue back. And so on its own, it doesn't have the commercial terms to substantiate or support a joint venture, where I'm going to put in money, I'm going to get my money back and split the revenue afterwards. There's no revenue from the road, at least not in Namibia. We don't have toll roads. Same with other forms of infrastructure, like certain buildings, for example. And so I don't think it will work for every single scenario, but where it can, yes, please. And I don't know if you still have the mic on you, but your second question, if I'm not mistaken, was just how we can structure better commercial agreements or commercial transactions. Please correct me if I'm wrong, or just get the mic right back. I think I already touched on joint ventures, where we agree that it's a great structure, and without giving a masterclass on how to structure joint ventures, because I don't think people will be interested in that. I think I touched it. Unless you want to expand on it, we can still have a chat after.
I will be quick. I think the question, if I remember correctly myself, was what can we do to be better prepared for negotiation based on the financial viability of the position we will put in ourselves to ask for such an amount of money and even get more than that.
Yeah.
Because it's so favorable. Yeah. What can we do in terms of that? I would advise the politicians, because they are actually the people we should advise, not us dealing with business people with the Chinese.
Yeah, with regards to that, it's a multi-layered question, right? Because there's so many components to making the transaction we execute better, both from having better finance people in the room, or the top finance people in the room to crunch the numbers for you, getting more expertise as far as commercial law is concerned and putting these deals together, getting better engineers on the ground to make sure that this thing is actually feasible, the market research, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, because there's so many layers, there's just quick things I'll say. One, improving our ability to navigate and use strategies to make sure that the reason why some of these deals are falling apart, or the reason why the terms of these deals aren't favorable, is because, or rather, it's not because we failed in the negotiation by virtue of being outmaneuvered in some way. It's the first bit. The second bit is simply continuing to expand the education and the knowledge base within Namibia as far as expertise in crucial areas, because a reality that is very unfortunate in the Namibian space is that there are lots of people that aren't educated to the degree that they need to be educated with for us to compete with certain spaces. There are lots of people who are educated. There are lots of people who are very qualified, and those people are doing what they can. But sometimes I think we're not enough, especially when you take into consideration statistics like 46% of the Namibian population lives without access to electricity. 46. We're like 2.5 million people, 1.1 million of them have to use firewood to cook, to heat up water, to clean themselves, and use up firewood for light in their house at night. And so when you have half the population in that kind of circumstance, and even within the rest, there are various economic classes and educational disparities and so on and so forth, there's a lot to work on. There's a lot to fix. And so for that reason, it's a multi-layered problem. And so I think I'd love to have like an hour-long discussion, or we'd love to have an hour-long discussion with you about it. But for now, I hope that's it.
Do you want to answer some of the economic type of questions? Well, please, a specific one.
We come to these meetings to get a balanced view of things. And something important happened this week. Putin invaded the Ukraine.
Interesting.
And it is up to the response of the world and the world leaders. China's response is quite interesting. That we condemned. Probably the only country that we condemned. So it tells you something about the power relationships. And China and Russia are setting up energy deals in their own currencies now in the place to push a dollar and things like that. The Chinese GDP is totally inflated and they've got base cities. And in fact, this year they started monopolies on the base cities. If you take our country, you can go to the construction federations industry. They complain about the labor practice of China and Namibia. So these guys will work. I remember one year, 25th of December, 12 o'clock at night, the crane was open. They bring convicts that they take out of jails in China who work here free of charge, no labor cost. So it's a powerful nation. It's so powerful that NATO has now declared war on Putin, and Putin is not in the Ukraine to invade the Ukraine. He's been patient for 8 years because they are hammering the Russians in the east of Ukraine. And he promised to help them. So I don't think there will be a third world war because China is involved and China is backing Russia. That's what we need between the lines. So in negotiation, in human factors engineering, my name is Peter Nutt and I do human factors engineering. We're talking of an asymmetric power gradient. You cannot negotiate with against a power gradient like that. You will always come second. And this is what is happening in this country. You never spoke about the Belt and Road Initiative, the New South Road, and those things. They give us infrastructure we don't need. We don't need the infrastructure that we can offer back. We don't need the weapon. What do you call it? The Chinese are still in the weapons. We don't need those. So they give us things that we don't need. They also do want to do it easy. So they put them. And then the conditions to do deals in Africa, you can look at the Tanzanian railway line, for instance. They use their equipment, they use their workers, their consulting engineers, everything comes from the outside. Our dealings are clear. They differ from the World Bank. They will take a month-year lease when you leave from Canada. The World Bank will sell your stuff. You can go look at Greece. What they did to the airport in Greece and the Olympic Stadium in Greece. So in terms of the balanced view that you owe us, you have to discuss these things. You can't just tell us the 36 strategies that you must use that will never make a difference in an asymmetric power gradient. It will never make a difference. So please end this discussion by giving us a bit of balance to the whole issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're obviously very passionate about the subject. I can respect that. Again, I'll start off by saying a similar comment that I said to our colleague earlier, which is, I mean, I love some of the texts that you're bringing forward. Please do email us some of the literature you have on that. Just so that we can also read those reports, read the published articles and so on, outlining some of the points that you put forward, because perhaps that's, especially with regards to the importing of criminals to work on, let's say, the Namibian projects, whatever the case may be. I haven't stumbled upon that literature, and if you could provide me anything to that extent, I think it would be great, so we can have a discussion about that as academics and researchers and so on. With regards to the balanced view and not mentioning the One Belt, One Road initiative, I'll have to ask you to give us some credit. We only had about 45 minutes. See what the topics here, man. I mean, how much do you expect us to cover, right? And so please do give us some indulgence on that point. Please do. With regards to necessarily unpacking the One Belt, One Road initiative, or unpacking the other perspective where we're talking about how all the deals China has been executing in Africa haven't been balanced, and how we have a negotiation gradient that we can't overcome simply by negotiating better because of the power dynamics that exist. I think that's why the first strategy I suggested works so well in terms of building coalitions of African nations that produce perhaps a particular resource that's important to China, and being able to begin to control supply and demand from a continental perspective, as opposed to one country with your few copper deposits or your few silver deposits. I think that's a first step towards balancing out that gradient, especially in key commodities that China really needs. But again, I will be careful with that question. I think we both will be. And we'll leave that right where it is. And what I mean by that is, you're right when you speak about some of the topics, like the One Belt, One Road initiative, but that's not something we're here to unpack, because we haven't brought enough literature on that to be able to speak competently about that matter. And so I hate to get into speculation, but if there's a forum where you can unpack some of that for us, I mean, I think we'll all be happy to listen to some of the research that you have on the matter. So yeah, thank you for that.
How do you feel? Thank you.
I'm going to like to comment about my experience with the Chinese, and Peter and his son won't let another Trump who speaks, so they're just going to have to flip what I'm saying. But what I can say is, the next time I go into negotiation, these are my men, not you two. So I have a fair amount of experience in dealing with Chinese. The first part in the mid-90s was quite negative. I'll be very frank with you. We were in Hong Kong when Governor Clinton gave over Hong Kong, and there was a huge fear in '97 that China was going to take over Hong Kong and Taiwan for that matter, and it's not much difference 25 years later. So we had quite official experience, and we went back and forth. And those Chinese in Hong Kong and Taiwan wanted to come to Libya to get another passport. It was simple as that. And most of those experiences were very negative. They were speculative, they went into land deals, and it was pretty negative. But it was encouraged by the Libyan government, who gave a permanent residence, which should never have been the case. I then read a book called The Gift of the Dragon. And that's a very balanced book. It tells all the good stuff and all the bad stuff. And there is a lot of bad stuff. There's a lot of labor abuse. There's a lot of exploitation, power gradients, all of that. But there are also good stories. And I'm going to fast track to my good story.
Yeah.
So I was chairman of an Australian uranium exploration company called Extract. And we discovered, by luck or science, I'm not sure, the second biggest uranium deposit in the world. We appointed advisors, and we had 12 bidders from around the world. So we could compare the negotiation tactics of 12 bidders from all over the world. And I have to say that during this process,
we learned many of the things that you've heard here today. The Chinese were extremely professional. There were two different companies. They were extremely professional from the beginning because they didn't want to be seen to be exploitative. The face, their reputations, all of that were extremely important to them. And what happened in March 2011 is Fukushima. So the 12 bidders went down to 2, and there were only 2 Chinese companies. And we suspected that they were together, but we never knew. There were only 2. Then, to make matters worse, we had another catastrophe called Hiroshima. And that was when the Minister of Finance decided to change the tax rates dramatically. The Chinese were in the final throes of bidding. They didn't go and see government because they said if we go and see government, it will be perceived as us using our struggle credentials and liberation, loyalty and all of that. They wouldn't go and see government. Then we had another catastrophe, Kauraisa, when the Minister of Mines said, if I'm going, I must get 26% of the shares. Again, by then we only had 1 bidder left. They said, that's okay. If you want to change your policies, that's fine. We don't invest. Even though they're a state company, they never talk to our state. They never talk to their Chinese embassy because they said, we will do it commercially. We will not interfere. And if you change your policies, that's fine. The president of this country, President Mahama, got to hear that they were pulling out. He begged me to bring the Chinese to him to explain that we will not do Hiroshima and we will not do Kauraisa. Fukushima, there was nothing we could do about that. And literally, they went to see the president. They said, Fukushima is not your fault. The other 2, if you assure us that you won't change your taxes and you won't take 25% free carry, we will continue. Listen to this. The price that they bid before Fukushima is the price that they honored a year later. Very few commercial enterprises in this world would have stuck to a $2 billion price that was in a competitive market at a high uranium price afterwards. And in our many dinners that we had afterwards, at the end of it, I said to them, why did you not change your price? Because we were expecting all of those negotiation tactics to happen. We were quite strategic on our side, and we never let them get us down from the mountain or any of those tactics. But I said to them finally, why did you not change your price? And they said, because we have faith. We bid, we honored our bids. They never talked to government, they never interfered, they never intimidated, and they were extremely professional. 10 years later now, there's still all this rhetoric that the Chinese bring all their workers and all of that stuff. And I can tell you this, that those 2 mines now, Husab mine and Rossi mine, have had between 3,000 and 4,000 workers over the last 5 years. They have never collectively had more than 200 Chinese on the mine. Husab during building perhaps a bit more than that, but that's the number they've had. And you know why? Because they've identified the expertise here. They don't like living here because they don't feel welcome here. They don't have the same social structure here. But still people are saying they've taken our jobs. It's utter nonsense. And now I'll tell you this. Yesterday, I took on the job of Chairman Grossa. And I'm telling you this because it was my experience at Husab in dealing with an incredibly professional group of Chinese leaders who were empathetic, knew more about us in general than we knew about any of them, who came in and delivered exactly what they promised in completely different circumstances. So 2 weeks ago, when Rossi, the other Chinese company that we dealt with 10 years ago, asked me to be chairman, I went and I grilled them on all these things. And I have to tell you that their localization, their local governance, their empowerment of Namibian skills is better than Rio Tinto's, than Anglo-Americans, than the Australian companies. So I can say that in the uranium industry, the Chinese interest in those 2 companies is of the highest quality, integrity, and decency. There are many examples in construction and elsewhere that are not like that. But this is something that Namibia should be celebrating. And they never abused their power grade enough, I'm sure. They could have, but they never did it. So this is an incredibly positive story, which reflects what you guys have been saying. So well done. You've got it.
One last more question, I think, from the house. Is there anyone with a burning desire to ask one last question or give a comment or a remark? 5, 3, 5, 4. Okay.
Come on, burning.
You touched on language and the importance of learning Mandarin or Cantonese. Could you explain a bit more in depth why it's so important, given that there are many Chinese people who can speak English, but also not just that, but how do you implement learning, perhaps in schools or in other institutions? You know, if there's an NCC for French, how can we create a better opportunity for learning Mandarin, for example?
Yeah, it's a lovely question. I'd love to talk about that. So I think definitely you can't go. So let me talk about languages first. So when you're trying to learn a foreign language as an English speaker, there's generally, I think the US Foreign Service is a ranking, just ranking the most difficult languages for English speakers to learn. Level 1 languages are French, Portuguese, Italian. Level 2, level 3, level 5 languages are Arabic and Mandarin, because they are the most linguistically and culturally difficult and different to English that you can get. They use a different alphabet. It's a tonal language, meaning the way that you pronounce the word could have 10 different meanings based on how you fluctuate your voice. And along with that comes the fact that China is an ancient culture. So their language has developed, organically over thousands of years, completely in isolation of, Germanic or Romance languages. And you can't overestimate how much of a difference that makes, both culturally, linguistically, and cognitively, how you think, how you reason, what's important. So I think firstly, that is one of the key challenges in bridging that cultural divide. And I think secondly, I mentioned how can we bridge this divide? And I think the Chinese are the best example. I mean, it's a massive government scheme to teach them English. A lot of Chinese, literate Chinese that graduate high school, that go to college, can speak English to an extent, or are very, very much encouraged to learn English, because that's sort of the lingua franca of the world. And I think as China is growing to be a much more global power, I think just almost probably naturally, organically, at least smart countries will see the value of learning Mandarin, and employ strategies, national strategies to learn more about the Mandarin language, which in turn will teach them a lot about the Chinese culture. And I think that ultimately I see as the key point in intercultural relations, and really a better understanding from two very, very different people. Thank you.
Just to add, Neil gave a very solid foundation to the very light sprinkle I'm going to add on top of it. And that light sprinkle is, it's a nice gesture. I remember when I went to go study in Scotland and hearing one of my lecturers who studied in the US all of his life and then worked for about 15 years in the UK saying, oh, you're Namibian? You're from Bloomfield? How old are you? You know the capital city of my country. I like you so much now. And it's one of those really, really small gestures as well, as far as building genuine relationships in the context of the fact that the Chinese are very relationship oriented. And I don't know if I've mentioned that, working in the field that I work in, I've seen contracts between multiple parties, and when the Chinese would enter into a contract with perhaps a foreign national, you see the contract is a bit lengthy. It has protections and warranties and all kinds of mechanisms to make sure that everything is clear and everyone's protected. But if you see a contract between two Chinese companies, it's one page. And I think I mentioned that. Did I mention that today? yeah, the contract between two Chinese counterparts will be 1 page. And it'll be like a $500,000 US deal. That's many millions and $1 million in this 1 page. And that proves to you how much relationship plays a role here, aside from the business. And so, again, it's just a nice touch to be able to engage with someone on their level, and it'll think much higher of you, and it'll oil the wheels a bit. Of course, you don't have to go through the effort of doing that. It's quite a difficult task. But if you're interested, if you care enough, if you'd like to take that position, then even just being able to stay behind, it's great. Yeah, and I think that brings us to the end of this wonderful, wonderful decision.
Thank you. Congratulations to you, going to the show.